Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Greer, and this is Conversations with Dr. Greer, and I'd like to thank the people at the World Puja Network for hosting us every couple of weeks here on the World Puja Network, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence and founder of the Disclosure Project, and I'm very pleased tonight to be joined by Raven Nabulsi, who is on the board of directors of the Orion Project and has been a very valued member of our team for many years now. And we're going to be focusing tonight in part on the events of the past couple of weeks where we were up in Joshua Tree National Park, which, of course, is in the high desert of California, east of Los Angeles. And it's an 800,000-acre national park where we have been going since 1996 on our contact expeditions. And we had an amazing week there with about 43 people in the desert. And the experiences, I think, were really historic. And we're going to be going into some of the contact events that happened, as well as some other upcoming things that are going to be unfolding with the Disclosure Project and the Orion Project as well. I'll mention a few things that are up and coming. So thank you, Raven, for joining us, and I'm very happy you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, why don't you, I don't know if one of the things I wanted to share is that this year we got we were in an area of the national park, and on the very first night after we had gathered and had dinner, which is our tradition for the first day, which we hosted at our home near the entrance to Joshua Tree, we went up to this site that we had been approved to go to with our group, and we set up, and of course we're going through the protocols, and we immediately started having a lot of electronic activities with the detector systems, the radar detectors, and the other electromagnetic systems, including the magnetometer. And in fact, as we were leaving our house to go up there, we had a series of lock-ons with the electronics, and particularly one that happened all week that was what we call a storm tracker. And what it is a rather fairly expensive piece of equipment that picks up the electrostatic discharge from lightning, except there was no lightning anywhere in that part of the United States. And it is typical of when an extraterrestrial vehicle is operating nearby and is sending out a pulse into that particular detector, and it's often transdimensionally, so it's actually working into the circuit. And what started happening was that the same thing that we discussed in England, where when we would be moving from one point to another, this storm tracker electronic detector would go off at key points where we would make a turn or when we were coming up to an intersection or what have you, as if to say, we are completely locked on to where you guys are. And so from the time we left the house until the time, in fact, the whole week, this was something that was actually phenomenal and happened every single night. And actually, Raven was in the lead car that we were in, that my team was in, and saw this happen. One day, in fact, as soon as we entered the vehicle, we had these electronics go off as soon as we closed the door, and we're just starting to head out. And it's really quite remarkable, because what we have found is that the interstellar civilizations that are observing Earth, once you open up sort of a link to them in higher states of consciousness, they completely have the ability to go inside these electronics and rather discreetly, in a sense, let you know that they're with you. And it's phenomenal, because we're in the middle of this 800,000-acre national park. There's no man-made source for these to be going off, and we're having this kind of tracking event take place from the minute we arrived at the national park and were leaving. We also had a sighting of an object that came out of the sky and went right in near the right of the vehicle, right above the ground, like a brilliant white orb-like object as we were coming into the park that first night, I recall. And so at that point, of course, we knew that we weren't going to be alone.
Exactly. I'm always so amazed that because that what you were saying happened every single night. It's not coincidental at all. It's just as soon as we are gathered, we get in our vehicle, the tracker went off, and I remember seeing the disc that went into the ground as we were driving into the park, and at the same moment, the detectors had gone off in our car when that happened. So they're just right there with us constantly. And even before the entire program started, we were there the night before, and we had all kinds of objects lighting up in the sky and a lot of electronic anomalies in the house.
That's right. I forgot about that. In fact, we got there a day before the training started, and we were at one point outside, and there was a brilliant flash that happened within feet of us while we were out near the pool of this house. So what we find is that as soon as we kind of set up in an area, we start having all kinds of anomalous electronic tones, objects that appear in the sky, as well as objects that appear very near us that are transdimensional. Is what I call this phenomenon of objects that are in the area going faster than the speed of light, not traveling, but just hovering or resonating, and they will burst into linear space-time. And, one of the things that I always try to explain to people is that if you're an interstellar civilization, you don't have to be in a solid materialized form that would be visible in its full materialized aspect. In fact, most of the time they're not. And when they do, of course, it's a big solid object, which we, of course, have seen and photographed and videotaped. But often there will be these other types of phenomena going on that are quite mysterious and are actually more elegant, because we know that there are a lot of military operations that track from space these extraterrestrial vehicles. And in fact, just before we left to go to Joshua Tree, I was meeting with a senior scientist who works for the Department of Defense in Washington, and with some other folks. And this particular scientist shared with us the fact that a general at the Defense Intelligence Agency had recently, in the last couple of months, been briefed on the fact that we had Star Wars-type weapon systems that were targeting and were fixed on extraterrestrial vehicles, but that also he had confirmed to him that out in deep space, somewhere in our solar system, it wasn't disclosed to us exactly where, was a massive extraterrestrial station of some type. In fact, the word station was used, and that it was clearly of artificial extraterrestrial origin, and that the general was very shaken by this, because he realized that there was a whole lot of nonsense going on with the SDI and Star Wars program that was really dangerous and very ill-advised, but it was really kind of out of his hands. And this particular scientist, of course, had been privy to these events, similar sort of data and what have you, from many years in the past. And he was sort of surprised that this senior general had just come across this information. And one of the things I point out to people is that there is that sort of a secret government within the government that runs these things, but they're frequently targeting and tracking these extraterrestrial vehicles even as they emerge out of a transdimensional state into linear space-time. And in fact, a scientist that I got to know, and the military advisor for our project, who was on the board of his corporation, had developed what's called a neutrino light detector that picks up this sort of subtle burst of energy that's released as an extraterrestrial vehicle is moving in the so-called near astral, the sort of dematerialized form, and is beginning to emerge into linear space-time, and that these had been, were basically stolen. This invention was stolen by the National Reconnaissance Office from this scientist and put on satellites in the 1970s. This was now, of course, 35 years ago or more. And so one of the things that we remind people when we're doing this interplanetary peace and diplomatic work that we do with the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and you can find out more about that at cseti.org, is that we're doing it within the certain realities of the current state of the world. And even though the general public doesn't know what the state of the world is on this subject because it's been wrapped in so much secrecy, the reality is that we know that this monitoring goes on, but the extraterrestrial civilizations are so advanced in their understanding of consciousness and technologies that interface with consciousness and things that go faster than the speed of light and are beyond the material linear space-time continuum, if you want to look at it that way, that they're able to interact with us in ways that are quite beautiful, whether it's through our electronics, through tones that appear around us. And all of this actually happened in a couple weeks ago while we were up at Joshua Tree National Park.
Yes, that was one thing I noted on this trip in particular. There was quite a number, almost every evening, where we had anomalous tones that were these very high-pitched electronic sounds, and we even had them in our house as well while we were eating dinner one night. And it's you just wonder what it is, if it's a form of communication or if it's a packet of information that's in this one single tone. But I think it's very fascinating that every time we go on a trip, it's like there's sort of a new level of unfoldment of how the contact is made with the ETs.
Well, in fact, on that first night, your husband, if you want to relate what he saw after you had the detector in the house go off and what he saw during that event, while at the same time there were two other members in the house who were having lucid dreams regarding contact with the ETs.
Right. Gosh, I might have forgotten what he told me, but that I believe he got up
and he looked. Whether it was there was your detector had gone off in your room, and then he got up to go to the bathroom and looked out the window, and there was this brilliant blue-white orb that was just a few feet from the window of the house that was shaking and just flashed in very brilliantly, which is very similar to what I had seen before we had gone to bed that night.
Exactly.
And at that exact time, another member of our team, Emery, and I were having very lucid dreams with specific extraterrestrial beings that were kind of dovetailing dreams. And, of course, one of the things I talk about is the connection between lucid dreaming when you're awake in the dream, because the dream state, when you're actually flying or having this very lucid awake dream, you're actually operating with your astral body and consciousness. And, of course, the Vedic masters all understood this, as do the Aboriginals in Australia had a term for this, dream time, as they called it. And what's interesting is that extraterrestrial civilizations, because they're moving faster than the speed of light, they're dealing with multiple dimensions with their technologies, and this includes the sort of subtle energy of the astral area of energy, and this is why so many people have amazing lucid dreams involving spacecraft and extraterrestrial beings, because when you're in the dream time, you're more open and have, in a sense, more freedom because of the nature of the conscious universe and the astral aspect of yourself. And it was interesting because at the exact instant, because we noted the time, it was like 10 after 3 in the morning, that your husband saw this object outside the house, just a few feet from the house, that flashed, and this sort of blue-white electric energy. This other member of our team and myself were having these very lucid dreams with specific ET beings, and this is very unlikely to be a coincidence, is my point.
Exactly. Now I'm glad you jarred my memory. There so much happened during the week, it's hard to keep track of it all, but I also remember that night it was difficult to sleep, and I remember waking up just prior to the detector going off and asking if they were still here, and then the detector went off and it woke up Todd, and then he, that's when he saw the craft outside.
Exactly.
You were having the experience in Emory, so.
The first night we were out, one of the bizarre things that happened, and of course, head of disclosureproject.org and the orionproject.org, there's always been a lot of monitoring of what we're doing, and at times interference by the intelligence community or shadowy interest. And the first night we were out, had set up, and we were in the process just about to begin the first remote viewing and meditation, where we use this protocol that we've developed to go into deep, unbounded mind and then remote view in space with consciousness where these extraterrestrial vehicles are, and then invite them or sort of vector them into where we're located. And we actually show them sort of a vector from where they are in space right into, say, if we're Joshua Tree National Park in a certain area, we show them exactly where our circle is. And at this point, of course, there were about 43 people there. And we also have these really bright lasers that we send up into space that will go 100 to 200 miles into space in clear air, and also these electronic tones that we've recorded not only from our contact, where we've had these beeping sounds, but as we did a few weeks ago with Charlie Baylog on this show, but also we have new ones that have just occurred this week in Joshua Tree. But all that's going on, and we were just about to go into that part of the first night where I'm sort of briefing people on how to make contact and set up, when some people, about 5 men, invaded the site. There was a couple cars that had been going back and forth on the main road through the national park, and I have night scope binoculars that are very advanced, almost fourth generation, advanced third generation, and I could see that they were a car team that were letting people out. Now, they came in pretending to be intoxicated campers from a campsite across the highway, but they were not. And they actually climbed on the rocks right above where our group was and started hurling epithets and cursing and making loud noise and banging things and banging metal things just to be disruptive, because we were about to start the meditation. Now, this sort of nonsense has happened before, and so I just told everyone, look, be calm, and we're going to check this out. And we took a little break, and I decided we would move where we were to maybe 100 to 200 yards away to another area further away from where these folks were. And as we moved to that site, well, Raven, why don't you share what happened, because it was kind of amazing, the sequence.
It was amazing. That was one night where it was fairly cloudy, and
it was the only night we had any clouds.
Exactly. Yeah, it was cloudy, and we went, just a little further down the way and set up, and it was almost immediate that the sky opened up and it revealed the constellation of Orion. And within maybe 5 or 7 minutes of being there, then we started seeing these flash bulbs coming out of the area of Orion. And there were a number of them, so there was probably a flotilla of ET craft in the area that we were able to videotape for, I'd say, almost 30 minutes. And it was just amazing that just this one little area of the sky opened up, and we were able to witness that, and everybody, saw it.
Well, and what's even more fascinating to me was that this went on for about half an hour, and what we call these flash bulbs are actually these brilliant emissions of light. Now, you have to remember, at the hour where this was happening, there were no satellites visible in the night sky. There were no aircraft. These were absolutely not aircraft. And there were more than one of them that appeared exactly in the area around Orion and Betelgeuse, which is a star to the left of Orion's belt as you look at it in the night sky, sort of a golden-looking star. And what's fascinating is that there were more than one of them, because they're the night binoculars, and we filmed this. Actually, your husband had night binoculars hooked up to a digital camera, so we actually have the footage of this. And we're doing all this at the same time we're having these electronics going off very specifically right on the ground that are these electronic detector devices, and we're in the middle of the national park. So these people who had invaded the site then scrambled down off these other rocks and moved and literally climbed 10 feet from my back on a bunch of rocks, and were just pretending to climb this rock at whatever it was, 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night. It was ludicrous.
Right.
And what they were trying to do is disrupt, because apparently they had been given a heads up that contact was happening, and they were trying to disrupt it and slow it down. But the ETs, these interstellar civilizations are so advanced, and what we're doing with consciousness, because it's all about sort of, now that we're on the World Puja Network, I can talk about this, the ancient Vedic knowledge of cosmic awareness. And we actually do pujas on these expeditions and contact events. And it's so beyond what these sort of clumsy folks can do. And so even though on one level it was disruptive from a sort of a linear and just logistics point of view, from the point of view of the contact happening that night, it didn't stop anything. And this is what is so amazing and in a way beautiful, because in a sense it's a metaphor for this sort of crazy world we live in, where there's so much chaos and so much stuff going on. And yet, if you're in that state of awareness, you can have seamless, ongoing contact, and nothing seems to affect that. It's beautiful.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important that, no matter what's happening, if you just, stay on your path and have that focus, it just, there's still amazing things that happen no matter what. And it was obvious from what had occurred that nothing was going to stop us.
That's right, and I think that they actually were quite frustrated. They only left when we decided we were going to leave, because we had all this contact. We'd filmed it. People had seen it. It was actually a very good night. But as we decided to do that, then they left. And as they did, I looked with my night scopes, and they had put down an infrared signaling device that I'm sure was a signal to the satellites that were imaging what was going on. And you could see it glowing in the desert as they left. Which we also filmed. So this is the kind of thing, I know it sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie, but this is sort of what happens. And on the one hand, it can be, it's an unfolding dynamic where here we are, a group of volunteer ambassadors to the universe is what we call the training course, making contact, and everyone's being trained in higher states of consciousness. We have all these electronics. We understand how interstellar contact can happen, way more sophisticated than just a clumsy machine moving through the air or something. And I think that this has become rather frustrating for the folks who are in these intelligence projects who would like to disrupt it, because in fact they can't. There's nothing.
Good.
And I think everyone there got that message. Everyone on our team, and there were probably 3/4 of the people there were people who had never been to one of these CSETI training expeditions and contact expeditions. And I think everyone got the message that in fact there was really nothing that could disrupt it once people are in that state of higher awareness. And we then also have the knowledge and understanding, which is a big part of the training, to understand how ET civilizations actually make contact with humans using a number of modalities. It isn't just by showing up physically, although we have had beings show up physically. This being last year that you photographed, the Raven, that was there, which was from the, we're quite sure was from the Andromeda Galaxy system, 2.5 million light years away, but also that all these other type of electronic events and signaling events, because the signaling events were very unmistakable in terms of the kind of things happening up there. And it's not a coincidence, in my opinion, that the sky parted and opened, and right there in that area of Orion, we have all these objects that appear and are sort of flashing and signaling. They look like brilliant flash bulbs that would be up in the sky, except there were 2 or 3 of them doing this, and I would then send my laser up, and there was all this kind of activity. And I'm really happy that all that got filmed, actually.
Yeah, and that, a few in 2007 when those first Orion transmissions took place, it's like we've now got this special link to that whole area of the sky. It's got quite a significance, and the fact that the clouds parted only to reveal that constellation, I thought was quite amazing.
Right, and yeah, I do want to point that out, that in the last 2 or 3 years, we started having what we call the Orion transmissions. It started in 2007, but then really continued in 2008, where out of the sector of Orion, there was a transdimensional series of communications that came through these electronic detectors after a series of really amazing events in consciousness that was also associated. I might remind people, when all that was finished, I put my laser up into the Orion sector, and this brilliant object started signaling just a few times from the area of Orion. And so, there in many traditions around the world, the Sirius and the Orion constellation, which come up right after, of course, the Pleiades and Taurus, are associated with civilizations that had brought teachings of higher consciousness and knowledge to Earth in ancient times. And I'm inclined to think that's true because of the experiences we've been having out of that sector of space. So it was quite big. And I have to point out that it was, I don't know how many days later, you might recall, Raven, that we had almost identical events happen at a different site. We eventually moved after that first night to a much more private site that was an undisclosed location.
You don't have a need to know.
Yeah, exactly. And which was incredibly dark and private and perfect. And it was a crystal clear night. And we had the same thing happen, and that lasted for 20 or 30 minutes as well.
Right. I think that might have been like in the middle of the week, a couple of days later. It might have been on Wednesday of that week when that happened.
Right. And we had these really brilliant objects again appear in the area around Orion. And this was at a site, I have to say, where we had an event take place that was very similar to the year before. Now, to remind people who haven't been following this saga, last year in 2009, when we were at Joshua Tree National Park, we were at a different site than this remote site that we found this year, but not that far away. And we had been out in the field at a break, and there was an orb that was about the size of a baseball that lit up right beside us as we were out in the field taking a break, and it materialized and floated beside us for just a few feet, and several of us saw it, and then it vanished. And we went back up to the circle where the group was, and then we heard a series of unintelligible but very distinct male and female voices talking out in the desert. Now, I put my night scopes on it, and it was just clear air. But this was nothing that just one person heard that was sort of a fictitious thing. It was absolutely there. And then that's when you might want to describe what that led you to take that photograph.
Right. We were about ready to come back to the circle, and I sat down and I just sort of took a series of photographs, kind of being in that state of consciousness, where I asked the ETs if, to use me and my camera as an instrument, if they are able to reveal themselves at all. And I took about 7 or 8 pictures, and all of them were completely black except for one, and I noticed there was like a light in this one photograph, and I didn't pay any attention at the time because we were getting ready to reconvene, but there was absolutely no light there at all when the photograph was taken. It was pitch black. Nobody had flashlights on or anything like that. And when I went back later to look at my pictures, I saw that there was this very bright orb, just very much like the one that we saw come down the path with us. And it was creating almost a cone of light that was illuminating several chairs, and above one of the chairs was this little being, this ET that was in the photograph. And I believe the picture is on the CSETI website.
It is, cseti.org is where it is. And although it doesn't look that great on the Internet, but when you see a high-definition image of it, it's astonishing. It's clearly a male ET that is hovering in this transdimensional cone of light. And it's an amazing photograph. And he's actually turning and waving at us and smiling, a very slight smile at Raven and at the group. as he's being held there. And this is the kind of thing that happens. I tell people if it wasn't strange, it wouldn't be extraterrestrial. It would be something man-made and hoax. It would be something maybe Steven Spielberg would pull out with a little bit of stagecraft. But in this case, this was the real thing. And this is what's so beautiful, is what we're finding out is that there are all these ways that contact happens. And now we're actually cooperating with the imaging photographically, electronically, videos, as well as still photographs with this kind of event taking place, with a whole group of people there who were, again, mostly new people. I mean, people who had not ever been out in the desert and had this kind of contact experience. And so it's really quite exciting. And I regard that as probably the most important photograph ever taken in the history of the ET and UFO subject in modern times, because there's no question that it's what we call a close encounter of the fifth kind, which is when humans invite the ETs to come, and they come. And it's not just a machine or a craft, it's the person actually in the photograph being held in this kind of an orb radiating this cone of light. And I liken it to sort of a very high-tech electronic astral projection, where if you can imagine dematerializing your body and being in this energetic form that can be moved around in sort of with high-tech electronics. And this is exactly what it was. And this ET, by the way, has a cranium, a head, that would be the equivalent of, if you look at your own head from your eyes up to the top of your head, it would be about 4 or 5 times that large. And it's clearly not a human, and it's clearly a humanoid, however, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and it's amazing. And we weren't, so surprised that happens, because many of us have seen other evidences of these ETs around, and at that same site a couple years ago, there were 4 ETs that fully materialized during the meditation, and we're standing there, and people were in meditation, and then when people brought other folks' attention to it, they turned and they just vanished, but they were fully there physically. So this is the sort of thing that has happened, and we suspect it will continue to happen increasingly as conditions allow. Of course, there are safety issues, obviously, because what we're doing is certainly being monitored, but people aren't particularly friendly to what we're trying to do and would like to slow it down. But one of the examples that we've learned this past week is that even with the most clumsy and, in a sense, juvenile disruption attempts, the ETs are still going to make contact in ways that are beyond the ability of folks to stop it. And yet at the same time in a very non-threatening way, a very peaceful way. And this is the thing that we have found. And one of the points I make to folks is that there's a lot of people who say, oh, well, Stephen Hawking this past summer said, or spring, well, we shouldn't have contact with extraterrestrials because they may want to colonize Earth and invade us and attack us and all this kind of xenophobic paranoia. And I kind of have to laugh, and I go, you know what? If you're capable of traveling thousands to millions of light years across space, it also means that you can materialize and dematerialize anything you need. Anyone who's done pujas and understand the Vedas and higher states of consciousness understand the science behind materialization. What on earth would they need to get from us here? Come on. I mean, they're going to come here for our gold and silver or coal, or, it's a very anthropocentric projection. It's sort of us projecting our own baggage onto these civilizations. And this is what you see in movies and in UFO literature in general. There's sort of this paranoid, fear-based view of these extraterrestrial visitors. But in reality, any civilization that could get here from another star system, there's nothing on this planet they need from us. And I think that, on the other hand, the evidence we have of extraterrestrial civilizations being very concerned with our nuclear weapons areas, our Star Wars efforts, our misadventures into space using both classified and non-classified spacecraft that are highly militarized operations, actually. Even the Apollo mission to the moon was really part of the Cold War space race with the Soviet Union. So I think that they're more concerned about human hostility. And I think that what has happened is that the intelligence community has done a masterful job at spin and flipping that around and trying to portray the fact that there's some threat from outer space, because eventually I think they feel that they could profit greatly from people being afraid of a new enemy once they kind of wring out all they can out of the Mideast and terrorism. So I think that this is something that people have to be aware of, and our experience. And now it's we're celebrating the 20th year of CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, going out all over the world having these kind of contact experiences, where we trained thousands of people who are now going back to their cities and their home countries, organizing contact teams who are having astonishing contact happening, and no one's ever been harmed. No one's ever been threatened. We've had humans try to disrupt what we're doing, but the extraterrestrials themselves are clearly non-hostile, and even the least amongst them, when I say least amongst them, the ones that are, maybe a few thousand years more developed than we are, they're clearly not hostile, because if they were, they would have the ability to make a lot of trouble for us, and it would have happened already. One of the things I point out is that a scientist we met with recently was talking about some experiments he had witnessed using scalar electromagnetic waves, and these are electromagnetic waves that are longitudinal instead of a sine wave sort of shape, and they travel faster than the speed of light. They're not limited to the 186,000 miles per second, which is the speed of light. And this was in a classified project in the military years ago. And what's interesting is that that particular system was being used for communication. But it's important to note that those same sorts of technologies can be weaponized and have been. That's what the Norway spiral was, that almost exactly a year ago when the President Obama was getting his Nobel Peace Prize, that was seen over Norway, that was reported on CNN and all over the world. It was a demonstration of a scalar electromagnetic weapon as a way of sort of sending a shot across the bow of the President, quite frankly. But, there weren't many people who understood what that spiral was or how it could have been formed. And, of course, they concocted some Russian missile that was fired that went out of control or something, which it clearly was not. All the missile experts who looked at the video footage of it said this is absolutely not a missile. But the point is that if the extraterrestrial civilizations were hostile, they have technologies that are thousands to millions of years further along than that. So it would be made very clear. And I tell people that empirically, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. We have gone out and had these sort of contact things happen, and it's always the most loving encounters and very nuanced and, in a sense, very based in consciousness and in full keeping with people's sensibilities, and if they're afraid or not, they don't push it any further. They're incredibly sensitive and compassionate about this, and almost Buddha-like. And so I point out to people that, the sort of accounts that you normally hear on this subject are these fearsome, terrifying things and encounters, which I've concluded are, for the most part, all military-induced hoaxes. And I think that this is one of the problems, is that people have to begin to understand that the best way to find the truth about something is to go out and find out for yourself. And that's exactly what we're trying to empower people to do. The whole purpose of the CE5 initiative, the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, is to train people in higher states of consciousness in the ability to remote view distances in space with the consciousness, to use thought as a vector to connect to the extraterrestrial electronic systems, and then use these other electronics that we have developed and use, as well as the lasers, to communicate and invite them. And let's see what happens. And people who are doing that in small teams, of course, these training expeditions usually are anywhere from 30 to 40 people or so. But if you're in a small group of 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 people, you can take this quite far. And we're finding that people who are doing this in Malaysia and in Africa and all over the world now are having amazing contact experiences happening in many different ways that it appears. And all of it's been very peaceful, and no one's had any experiences that have been in the least negative. And this is why I tell people need to be trained on this so they find out what the truth is. And the great teacher ultimately in life is experience rather than learning things second and third hand. We are actually planning right now to do, we may be doing, you stay tuned, you can go to cscti.org. We may be doing a 3-day event in Southern California in February. This is a tentative. And then we're also looking at a week winter retreat in Florida on Marco Island. And this is still in the planning stages, but it looks like we're going to get permission to use a park exclusively for our team on the Gulf of Mexico, which would be amazing, and that would be in March. And then in June, we're going to be in the Rocky Mountains up in the mysterious valley, the San Luis Valley near Crestone, Colorado, in June. And so just look to the website, and you can get on our mailing list if you want to find out where we're doing these expeditions next year. We're also planning to go to England. As you all know, Colin Andrews and I have worked since, almost 20 years now, 19 years, with the crop circle events. And for many years we went there, and then there was a hiatus after the Disclosure Project where, frankly, I was just too busy to get back over to England. But last year, well, I should say this year, in 2010, we went, and we had just, I think, the most extraordinary experiences we'd ever had there. And so we're planning to go back in July, late July of 2011, with a much smaller team. Instead of 40 people, it'll be 20 people. And we will be going to the crop circles during the day and then going out at night. Often we will do this kind of contact work inside a crop circle, which is awesome, actually, amazing. So there's a whole series of photos and videos from the last few months that we're trying to get put together on a DVD for folks, but a few of them are up on the CSETI website at cseti.org, so you may want to check that out. But this is continuing to happen, and if you just stay tuned or get on our mailing list, we'll let you know where we're appearing, and hopefully it'll be someplace near where you are.
One thing I wanted to mention is you were just mentioning photographs. This time I did manage to get a couple interesting photos where there was a tiny little disc that appeared, and also some fully manifested orbs that I got in darkness. And I know Emery Smith on our team also photographed, I believe, a disc in broad daylight. Correct. As well as some other anomalous orbs and things out in the field and at night when there was no other form of lighting. And one thing I wanted to mention also is at the new site we went to, there was a phenomenon with the magnetometer where it was acting almost like a heartbeat when Emery was holding it up next to you when we went on a break, and that's when I was spinning around uncontrollably in that same area where there was definitely something going on there.
Well, yeah, there was an area where I did a puja, in fact, and it was the first time I'd done a nighttime puja out in the wilderness like that, and it was beautiful, and Raven assisted me with it, and we're sitting on this sandy spot out in the middle of Joshua Tree National Park at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I guess, and it was gorgeous, I mean, because Orion was rising in the east, and we were facing east, and we do this puja, and at this same site, we had a number of phenomena happen where there were not only objects that flashed in, so really brilliant white, diamond white objects that would flash in and illuminate the desert floor, but these sort of orbs, and both Emery and Raven got almost exactly at the same time the same objects. So we know that they're real, and they were very, very close to us. In fact, they're just a few feet from us in some cases. They're right behind me, and this was the same site also. Before we run out of time, we need to mention the amazing tones that we had. Now, as all of you know, if you go back to the late 1980s, 1989, in the crop circles in England, Colin Andrews was with a BBC crew and recorded some tones that were actually very electronic, and in fact, they were of such an unusual quality that they damaged the circuitry of the beta cams of the BBC camera crew, and did, I understand, something like $75,000 in damage to their equipment. But luckily we haven't experienced that. But at the same time, there was Pat Delgado was with Colin Andrews, who, by the way, coined the term crop circle, who was in this vortex of energy where he was at like a 45-degree angle spinning. And, Raven, you experienced almost the identical thing at this site where we had this contact happen.
Yeah, it was almost embarrassing. But I was just walking up to meet my husband, Todd, and all of a sudden it's like I was on some sort of moving, like, circular board, and I was spinning around him, and I really couldn't control it or stop it, and I wasn't dizzy or any, no physical ailments prompted that whole thing. It was just a very strange phenomenon, and finally I settled down. But it was just amazing. I had never experienced something like that, but it was right near where the puja was done, and there was this beautiful Joshua tree just standing there kind of singularly. It just seemed like it was a magical little spot. And I believe that's where also Emery had the magnetometer, and he was kind of holding it up to different people to see if there was any kind of readings. And then when he got close to you, Steve, it sounded like there was a heartbeat in the magnetometer. That was just amazing, and it was just going on and on and on, and it was ticking just in a rhythmic pulsation, just like a heartbeat.
There was a transdimensional ET that was there in sort of an electronic form. And this, what a magnetometer is, for those of you who don't know, it actually picks up fluctuations in the magnetic field. Now, if you put a magnetometer near a television set or your motor of your car, it will go off because those motors put out a magnetic field and the alternators and generators. But when you're out in the desert in the middle of 800,000 acres of wilderness, you shouldn't have a magnetometer going off, especially when there's no other equipment nearby, and there wasn't any. And this, what Raven is talking about, was a very specific contact that happened. And it was exactly like the beating of a heartbeat that was beating and moving the electromagnetic field, and the magnetometer was pulsing with it. Now, what's interesting about that is a virtually identical event happened just a few months earlier when we were in France, and we went to an area in Brittany on this 2,000 acre old estate that dates back from the 1400s. In fact, some of the founders of the French Republic owned that land, and they hosted us there when we were there in July of this year in 2010. And we were in this field where there were some ETs that had fully materialized, about half a dozen of them. And when we approached them, you could hear them running off. But then they sort of dematerialized and came around us. And I was holding my compass, and Emery was holding this same magnetometer, and it started doing the exact same thing. It started being beep, 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 beep at about 80 beats per minute. And then they seemed to get more excited, went up to about 108 beats per minute. And at the same time, my compass, the needle on it, was beating in synchrony, complete synchronously, with the magnetometer. And we're out in the middle of this huge 2,000 acre estate, in the middle of a wheat field, with this kind of thing happening. So these are the sort of things that happen. It's extraordinarily, I mean, when you hear about it, you kind of go, what the heck is this? But when you're there, it is so palpable and amazing. So it happened again at Joshua Tree this a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, another incident that occurred, it was on the last night. The field on the north, there were a couple of things actually, but the field on the north end of our circle was just illuminated with just all kinds of sparkling little objects and areas, and everybody, even if people hadn't really been able to perceive much during the week, I mean, that was definitely undeniably there. And that's, in fact, one of the evenings when I got a picture of a large orb near that field, and I believe that's when Emery got some stuff too. But there were just all kinds of beings and probably a dematerialized ship in that field.
I have no question that that's what it was. And in fact, when a group of us with Debbie Foch, who's our webmaster for cseti.org and disclosureproject.org, and you and Dr. Bravo and some of us were up there, we were walking back and we heard these distinct tones, and we could see these lights, and then we heard the trilling sort of electronic tone, exactly what the original tone in the crop circle was in 1989. I mean, it was right there, and we heard it twice. And what's exciting is that we had a new audio recording system that didn't pick that up, but when we were in our circle, did pick up a series of tones a couple of nights before the last night that were 3 sets 3. And it comes into this whole, we call this equilateral triangle geometry and tetrahedral geometry. But it was moving in the space right in front of where I was sitting, and Dr. Bravo and Emery and you and Todd. And these tones were just literally in the air, and they were moving. And it happened 3 different times, 3 very distinct, quick electronic tones, and they did get recorded. So we have a whole lot of new material to analyze from this particular week, that's for sure.
Yeah, and there was also an occurrence one night where the horn of the car just honked by itself while we were sitting in the circle. The car was parked sort of at the edge of the area where we had done the puja, and it just went off by itself.
Well, that's right, and in fact, it happened. We had seen a big golden orb that had lit up right beside the vehicle, just outside the circle. Mm-hmm. And I was talking about it, and shortly after that, it was as if the ETs were accentuating it. They lit up the lights on the car and did it like the alarm system, but the keys were put away. It was something that happened. Everyone saw this and heard it. It was an electromagnetic anomaly that was clearly something quite mysterious. What's interesting is that when we were in France, this happened one evening where there were half a dozen cars where that was happening to. There was some sort of energy field moving over the vehicles. And, I mean, this would be like something out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind bizarre. But, and where they would go off, and we were going, what is going on with these vehicles? And this is not unusual where if the extraterrestrial civilizations feel that perhaps there's space reconnaissance or they're not going to fully put a ship right there where people are, they'll do these things. And sometimes it's because people aren't ready. You know, one of the things we had happen a couple years ago at Joshua Tree is that there was a man who had a lot of, you know, and it's I guess a lot of anxiety in his life. And we were doing our meditation. We were at that point. If you guys have heard the meditation I do, where we go into God consciousness and remote view, and then we do this prayer for the healing of the earth and for universal peace, and not just world peace, but interplanetary peace. And we're in this deep place in meditation, and suddenly this one particular person in our group who had a lot of anxiety issues, frankly, but who's a wonderful person, had clearly had an ET say, would it be okay, is the group ready for us to fully materialize? And it was their polite way of saying, are you going to freak out? And he basically said, he checked, and he said, yeah, we are. And at that instant, there was a craft that was about 15 feet above us that materialized from the east side of the circle. And it had the strangest sound to it. I'll never forget it because it made it sound like, and it floated about 15, 20 feet above us on the south side of our circle, coming from east to west, and just above a Joshua tree that was there. And it was so close, and it was fully materialized. You could hear it, you could see it. I felt like if I had stood on my chair and jumped up, I could have touched the underside of this disc. And it materialized maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 feet to our east, floated over the circle, and then dematerialized maybe 20, 30 feet to the west of the circle. And so it was just a short time, but it was like they were very careful to be sure that this particular person and the group was ready. And I think they felt that maybe he would have been the one that would have jumped out of his skin when that happened, and he was okay. Now, right after that happened, we continued the meditation, and a few minutes later, a brilliant, huge white ship lit up in east of the field, right over this site that I call the landing site, where in 1996 we saw this massive 200 or 300 foot diameter flat on the bottom. It sort of looked like a Hershey's Kiss that came straight out of the sky, sort of teal green color, and lit up the desert. And I'm quite convinced that there's a transdimensional sort of interstellar location somewhere up there in Joshua Tree National Park. In fact, I know exactly where it is. And they were showing us that. But we've had so many things happen in this same area. And luckily, this site that we found for this year, which we hope to return to, which will remain undisclosed, we want to remain private, I think is really amazing because it is so private, and we had so much contact happen there in many different ways. And the sky was just stunning. It was dark, and there was no light pollution from any source in this particular area of the park. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that there was one day where we, thanks to Raven, we found a few years ago, in fact, it was right before we did the Disclosure Project event at the National Press Club in Washington in 2001, so this would be 9 years ago, I had found a Native American cave, initiation cave, a shaman's cave up in Joshua Tree. And so every year now we go there and we do a puja at the entrance to this cave, and then we go in the cave. Only 8 or 9 of us at a time can fit. And I do a meditation in there, and it's just so beautiful. But on the way both to the cave and back, there were brilliant ET objects that were photographed and moving along with us as we went in and out of that site. It was truly beautiful.
Yeah, that's one of the spots where, as we were leaving the cave, I did manage to snap a few pictures that had some really bright orbs in them. And in previous years when we've left that cave, that's exactly where the picture of kindness and Sherry was taken as well. So
That's right. That's correct. Yeah. So anyway, it was a memorable event all around, and I do want to thank you, Raven, for being there and helping so much and all your great skills. And if folks want to find out more about what we're doing, there's a book that came out just in the past year called Contact, Countdown to Transformation, that has with it a DVD that comes free with the book that shows a lot of these sort of events happening. And you can get that at disclosureproject.org. And the book and the DVD come as sort of a set. And there are also the meditation tapes for learning how to do the mantra meditation as well as the remote viewing and the contact protocols that are on the same site. So if you're interested in doing this or looking into it more, feel free to visit that site, and all those materials are there. Also, there's a book called Disclosure that has the testimony of nearly 70 of these top-secret military witnesses that we've interviewed. And just as a quick note, I want to say that soon we're going to be releasing posthumously the testimony of a very important top-secret witness that I filmed some years ago, but who would not permit us to release his testimony until he passed away. We have just received the death certificate and a note from his wife, who survived him, saying that it was his wishes that after he passed away it be released, and we do have a copy of the death certificate. And so this is something we have pulled out of mothballs and we will be releasing. So stay tuned for that. It's a very important testimony from this military and corporate contractor who has a lot of information on this subject. And there'll be more of these forthcoming. People have to understand there's about 110 people that we have interviewed whose material we've been able to release. There's another 400 or 500 that I've met with who do not want their information out. Some of them have given us interviews but have asked that it not be released until after they pass away for their safety and their family safety. So stay tuned for that as well. Well, I think we're out of time. I'd like to thank you, Raven, for joining us today. And
thank you for having me.
Oh, and thank you all at the World Puja Network for hosting us here, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. And until then, keep looking up, and God bless. This is Dr. Stephen Greer with Conversations with Dr. Greer. Good night.
Good night.